Paso-Primero Tinto, the first wine, the wine that launched the company, the wine that started everything. It was a dream of ours. It was the mythical wine that we wanted to make. I am, in a different video, I will tell the story of how I fell in love with wine, but we were living in Canada when we decided to make the leap of finding somewhere to make our own wines. We were cold in the winters, hot in the summers, but making cool climate wines, and we were discussing where we wanted to go in the world of wine. Now, we could have stayed in Canada, absolutely, loved it. Brilliant winery, brilliant team, brilliant life we'd set up for ourselves, but there was a scratch that we wanted to itch, and that scratch was making old world wines, the sort of wines that we fell in love with when we first started getting into wines. You could say the sort of wines we fell in love over if you were getting romantic about it, but those reds that we could afford when we were first starting out, that were rich, round and rewarding, they were the wines we wanted to go and make. I don't want to dumb those wines down. This is not me saying those wines were no good. Quite the opposite. These were wines that were a little bit above supermarket pricing, but delivered 10 times their value. These are the wines that really you gravitate towards when you first start drinking wine. They're gateway to a world of flavors. Nobody's starting out drinking hipster pet nats, right? You come into it from different angles, but usually you start with that rich, round, rewarding, plush fruit. Something that if you forgot everything you knew about wine and someone tried to explain it to you, this is what you'd expect it to taste like, right? And we believed that coming to Europe returning to Europe was the right thing for us to do, and working in the old world. Now, again, another video will be able to discuss Brexit and all of the shenanigans there, but look, it's 2015. We are full of vim and vigor from 4 or 5 years of professional winemaking by this point, and we were looking for somewhere to make our wines. Now, during those winters in Canada, we had set about deciding where to go, doing it all on paper, and there was no links, there's no money behind us, there's no serious wine family donating their chateau to us. I'm not resurrecting the chateau for Channel 4 or anything like that. This was just 2 people who fell in love with wine and then started forging their path towards it. And so we'd come up with Spain as our destination, and we started drinking a lot of Spanish wines, and we started narrowing it down. And at the time, we believed having a DO was a very important part of our future sales. We knew that we had good links to sell to certain customers, but if we wanted to sell to people who didn't know us, we thought the DO would give us that little gold medal, that little stamp of approval that would justify people trying our wines. Now, again, things that you think of when you're younger, not necessarily things that you agree with when you're older. I'm not so sure I'm that committed to the DO system, but we'll put a pin in that at the moment. We wanted a DO. We didn't think we could afford Rioja. We didn't think we could afford Navarra. We didn't think there was lots of places that we thought would be off limits to us, and also have pretty strict rules. There's a reason why you can only grow certain varieties in certain areas and age them in a certain way, and that's great. That gives you, that is the DO working its magic in, that if you want a wine to taste a certain way, that's where it works. But we needed some freedom to make something fast, turn it around in our style and put our label on it, and have fewer restrictions while still upholding the DO standards. And through all of our searching, we realized that Somontano, this region in the north of Spain, was a very, very young DO, and it was a very approachable DO on paper, with lots of varieties that you could use, lots of freedoms in terms of how you age it, as long as you're not using certain terminologies, things like that. And we just thought, because it's a young DO, it would be the young, vibrant place to turn up, and that we would have opportunities to make our wine. Now, a lot of this story is predicated on the experiences we had previously, right? So we had worked in England, we had worked in New Zealand, and we had worked in Canada. 3 incredibly young wine regions, and because they're young, everybody is very well connected, everybody shares information, everybody shares, there's politics involved, don't get me wrong, but everybody knows everybody else within their industries. And one of the things that we saw a lot of in New Zealand and Canada was this idea of cuckoo winemaking, or basically it's a way of keeping talent within the cellar. You've got assistant winemakers who you don't want to lose, but there's only one head winemaker job or two head winemakers jobs, so there's not much movement upwards. So you allow the assistant winemakers to make their own wines, and give them an opportunity to use the kit of the cellar, maybe use some of the vines, but to create their own wines in their own style after hours. They do their normal day's work and then they start working on their own wines with the hope of either, I guess, selling that wine and building up enough money to do their own thing, or catching the eye of a wealthy benefactor, or maybe just doing something that gives them the creative output to make their own wines whilst maintaining the 9 to 5. And that was very common in New Zealand, it was very common in Canada, and if it wasn't something that a winery offered, then they would know someone who did that. And there was lots of horizontal movements to try and keep talent within these regions, to prevent people from wanting to go and be a winemaker, not having a role in their own cellar. And so we believed that this sort of communication was global. We thought this was the way the world of wine worked, and we set off to Spain believing that if we knocked on enough doors and we talked to enough people and we told them our story, someone would say, we can't do that, but you should go and talk to so-and-so, and maybe if you talk to them, they'll help you. And we thought you'd be passed along, you'd find a doorway and they would open a window, whatever the phraseology is. But when we got here, in that early summer of 2015, we're camping in a tent. It's not the best time to be in the Spanish sunshine, but we were cruising around Somontano, we were knocking on doors, and we got a lot of no's. We got a lot of straight bats, not quite doors in faces, but certainly, what are you talking about? That doesn't happen. We hadn't factored in the fact that even though this DO is young, it is not a young region for wine production. There is not a movement between cellars. These are staff that are, the sort of wineries we were talking to were family members. The crews were second or third or fourth generations, and that works in the vineyards as well as the cellars, and there just wasn't the same connections. And there's wineries around here who have fallen out quite a long time ago and still don't talk to each other. It's not a happy family where a rising tide lifts all ships. There's a lot of I'm all right, Jack, see you later. So we were not expecting that. We were not anticipating that, and we carried on knocking on doors. It sounds absolutely ludicrous to me now. We didn't have smartphones. We were relying on internet cafes and very basic connectivity at the campsites. We had no plan, we had no structure, we had no contacts. We were just winging it. It was look on the internet, who's local, where should we go today, let's drive, knock on the door, send an email, make a phone call, but limited Spanish. It was tough, and there's a lot of naivety in this story. I was talking the other day about bravery, and a lot of people say that we are brave, and the guy Nico, the winemaker here, he said it's not bravery, it's unconsciousness. It's not that you went, the analogy he used is there's a room with a rabid dog in it. Bravery is going into that room because the dog's there and you need to sort something out. Unconscious is opening the door because you didn't know it was there in the first place, and that's sort of what we were doing. We just didn't weigh up the issues because we were just pushing forwards, and we just kept going and hoping that something would land, or just believing it would land in that sort of youthful exuberance of that's not going to hurt me, and if it does, it doesn't matter, just keep going. And so that was the approach we took, and we went I could list the cellars, but we went to quite a few, and we ended up with a situation where we thought, we're done here. We are going to have to move on. This isn't the place for us. We had one email left, and they'd agreed to have a meeting with us. They'd agreed to have a chat. We didn't have a lot of hope for what was going to come. So we had started formulating the plan to Navarra. We'd started figuring out where we were going to go and how we were going to approach the next few days, few weeks, whatever it was. And we turned up to a cellar. Now, a lot of the romanticism of wine is based around the beauty of the vineyards, the stunning architecture of the wineries, the decadence and indulgence, or whatever the right terminology is. What we turned up to that day wasn't exactly filling that brief. So I think I'm going to try and take you for a little walk. So let's have a little sip on that. All right. So you've got to think 2015, we're tired, sleeping in a tent. The night before, a fox pooed on the tent. Another good story for another day. And we were trying to set up a situation. Lock the door, so we'll have to start again. So we've tried to figure out where we're going to make our wines, how we're going to get to it. We've got a lot of no's. We've got a lot of people saying, don't think you'll be able to do that in Spain, or don't think people will like that. Don't think people will want to share their cellar with you. I don't think people will listen to what you've got to say, and I think you'd be better off sticking to the new world, or figuring out something with someone that you already know. And we just didn't really think it through. So we were pretty down on our luck and feeling a bit miserable. Then we got lost trying to find it a few times, and we drove to this quite extraordinary industrial park. There's a distribution centre for Amber beer, no shop unfortunately, on a not very exciting road, middle of nowhere, bit of scrubland, and then we saw the sign, right? We saw Batan de Salas on this rather unusual looking property, and we thought, right, we'll go in, we'll see what they've got to say, see what we can do, see if we can pitch ourselves, see if we can find a way of keeping this dream alive. And we came through the door and came into this room, which hasn't changed at all in all of that time. There's a few additions maybe, one of them being the Shrewsbury Town shirt where one of the clocks fell off and broke, but I've got to leave my mark somewhere. And we came in and we sat down at this big table behind me, and we had a sit-down meeting with a guy called Nico. Nico was their head winemaker, spoke really good English, and we decided we would have a sit-down, figure out the plan, right? We would tell him what we wanted to do, and we would see if there was any opportunities to do it. And for whatever reason, he took the time out of his day to sit down and indulge us in what we had, what we wanted to do. And that hour turned into 2 hours, and that 2 hours turned into 6 wines, and turned into lunch, and it turned into a series of days where we saw Nico, drank wine with Nico, and realised that here was someone that we could really get on with. And even if we weren't going to work together, this was someone that we wanted to be friends with. And we got on like a house on fire. And we managed to persuade him that we were worth talking to the bosses, the owners. And so we got called into a sit down. It was very nervous situation for us. We walked through that door, came to this big table, and there was someone sat in every place. And we sat down next to Nico, who was our interpreter, and he was talking to Mariano, the boss, and trying to explain that it was worth letting this long-haired idiot from England and his long-suffering wife come and make their wines in their cellar. And had this big, serious chat. Mariano sat, big, barrel-chested guy, smoking his cigar, sitting at the head of the table, taking it all in, asking the old question. Nico translates, and just checking what our experience was, what our goals were, what we were aiming to achieve. And then all of a sudden he stands up, kicks his chair, rolls back, he strolls over and he goes, "You're crazy. I like you because I'm crazy too." Big bear hug, massive handshake. Let's do this. And that was that was the freedom of the park. We were allowed in. Come and make your wines. Come and make the wines that you believe in. And in 2015, that's exactly what we did. We came to Spain to make a wine, and we had it all mapped out what we wanted to make. And it was Paso-Primero Tinto. It was the first wine of our journey. It was the first wine of our portfolio, and it was designed to be that beautiful table reds, that get home from work and I just want a glass of wine red. You know, I talk about it a lot, where beer has managed to put itself in this brilliant position where everyone understands that moment of taking a cold Pilsner out of the fridge after a hard day's work, you know. But wine has those moments too. You know, there are times where you just want to go and have a glass of red wine. Kids are in bed, you've cooked a Sunday roast, whatever it is, whatever your red wine moment is, we wanted to make the red wine for that moment. And in 2015 they said, can you make, you can make that wine here and it will make 8,000 bottles, and if you can sell it before the next harvest, you can come back and do it again. And I think we managed to sell through those bottles in about 6 months. Shocked them. They were probably not expecting to see me come back through the door, but off the back of that wine, we now have 7 wines in our portfolio. We've got collaboration wines, we're farming indigenously, we're regeneratively farming, we're organically farming. We've completely turned the corner on how Somontano wines are perceived, and we really do believe that we're making a difference, and it all comes from that first red wine. So Paso-Primero Tinto, it might just be our house reds, but it is the foundations for everything else that came after. So that's Paso-Primero Tinto. Thanks for watching, thanks for buying, thanks for drinking. Hopefully we can have some more stories soon. Cheers.